Welcome to the IPX True North podcast, where we connect people, processes, and tools.
Welcome back to another True North podcast. I'm your host, Joseph Anderson. We're joined today by Dr. Nate Hartman. For those of you that have been with us now for a little while listening to our episodes, Nate and I have been discussing kind of the future of the industrial ecosystem and what that means and the topic across the DNA, across your business, across your organization, and even large corporations. So Nate, thanks for joining me again. I'm looking forward to this discussion. Anything you'd like to say to our audience before we begin?
Yeah, thanks for having me back, Joe. Much appreciated. Good to see you again, as always, and looking forward to some exciting conversation today.
Yeah. As usual, I throw Nate under the bus, and we really don't have an agenda or topics. But today, Nate, for this episode, I really want to talk about U.S. manufacturing. I know we have a global audience, and all this is related from touch points of the supply chain. But I really like to talk about today what we're doing as a country from your perspective. And obviously, this is all just two individuals talking and giving perspective, neither right or wrong. But I'd like to, from a university perspective, from a personal perspective, where do you think we're at? For me, we've chatted about the microchip, the semiconductor industry. We've had a lot of great discussions. But from a U.S., from an investment, from an innovation, what are your thoughts on where we're at today, really where we were at yesterday, maybe where we're trying to be today, and what the future might hold? Because it's my opinion that we really need to invest more in the capability from a manufacturing perspective across the board. High tech, components, we've got workforce development issues, but where do you think we're at?
That's a really good question, Joe. As usual, there's a lot for me to unpack there. I think certainly as we've come out the other side of the pandemic, or at least we hope we have, we've seen certain things some things are good, some things not so good. Certainly we have had our supply chain challenges. Depending on the product, we still continue to have supply chain challenges in certain segments of the market. One of the things I think that might be different this time around is, we see companies of various sorts in various sectors beginning to bring things back, if you will, maybe as a way to manage cost, maybe as a way to manage quality, maybe as a way to try to avoid the supply chain challenges that the pandemic highlighted. I think there's a variety of reasons why companies are beginning to pull some operations, some production, some supply network back to the U.S. Certainly not to say that globalization is going away. It's certainly not, but maybe not quite, or I should say maybe not being quite as reliant on international locations for key components of their products, key components of their systems. I also think we're seeing maybe a renewed interest, maybe a new round of support that ends up meaning, could be financial, could be otherwise, from the federal government. I think we're seeing that in, again, certain key sectors, right? Folks in the news media highlight the microchip scenario as one of those key areas that the government is investing into, but the government's also investing into materials research, into battery technologies, electric vehicle forms, in a lot of cases because the materials needed to make those things are found in the natural world graphically in places that are sometimes not very friendly to us, or vice versa. I think it's important that we diversify, as the old business adage goes, right? We're also beginning to see other investments, other ideas and strategies coming from both the federal and state levels about manufacturing. Here in Indiana, certainly we have a governor who's very friendly towards business. We have generally a legislature, I think, that's friendly towards business. We have a state that has an infrastructure for companies to set up, products and services to move around, those sorts of things. Certainly, we're not the only state that has that, but by many accounts in the media, and that we're one of the more friendly states towards that. And we're also seeing renewed interest out of some of the federal funding, which are places that those of us here at a university often interact with from a research and development perspective. We're seeing renewed interest in application-oriented research. We're seeing continued interest in public-private partnerships between academia and government and industry, developing ecosystem-level capabilities and capacities for everything from entrepreneurial startups to production organizations in specific components or sectors. So we're seeing quite a bit, I think. One thing that's arguably lacking, or at least maybe to take a look at it from a positive direction, might be in its very nascent stages, is some kind of a larger cohesive strategy that holds things like that together. We saw this begin to occur back in 2011, 2012. President Obama launched the Manufacturing USA Institute Network. It has had its successes. It's had some of its challenges. Certainly, we're seeing a renewed interest in the administrations in between in terms of manufacturing support, U.S. competitiveness. So I think all in all, we are headed in a reasonably good direction. There could always be improvements. There could always, some people would say additional funding. Some people would say different taxes or regulation kind of policy. Some people would say increased globalization. There's always going to be a variety of opinions about this, at least from where I'm sitting here. Generally, if we can keep inflation at bay, generally things seem to be moving in a good direction.
And then one thing before we talk about the future and the investment for our audience, many of them might struggle with is from a microchip perspective. You mentioned that. We've seen over the last few years the edge in the demand, from a product perspective, but microchips were invented in the US, and I'm going to get their names wrong. The year wrong, I believe it was in the 1940s, Texas Instrument. I think it was Jack Kilby and maybe Roger Noyce. But anyway, we've invented this technology, and this capability. Why would we let that go? From a listener perspective, from a manufacturing capability, from innovation, it seems that a lot of these things that get designed here from an innovation perspective or conceptualized, we produce them. And at times, sometimes from a strategy perspective, it seems that especially when it comes to manufacturing, the 90s, early 2000s, there's a push to really offshore a lot of that. And maybe that was a mistake and we keep the politics out of it. But when we're trying to bring that back in and we're starting to invest in innovation, from a government level, from the federal side, how do we ensure that we don't make the same mistakes of the past where we invest, we spend money on this research, we get this amazing technology, and then we become complacent with it and we go after the next shiny thing. But the reality is if we would foster that, that's a lot more jobs, right? When you're talking about U.S. capability.
Yeah. I think some of it is inherent to commerce, right? Some of it is inherent to trade. We use commerce and trade internationally as a vehicle for relationships with other countries. One could make the argument that a strong global trade mechanism helps promote peace and prosperity around the world. Folks may not be as desperate, thus wanting to take desperate measures if there's a strong global trade and economics are balanced, wealth is balanced, productivity is balanced, right? But we don't necessarily live in such a perfect world, right? It's hard, I think, in the moment for entrepreneurs, for inventors, for companies who create some kind of a discovery. Obviously, there are laws and policies about protecting intellectual property or filing patents or those kinds of things. Obviously, as global trade developed, there are ways that patents and intellectual property are protected internationally. There's also ways where they're stolen internationally. But certainly, sometimes it's hard to know what you might have in the moment. And looking back 40, 50, 75 years, however many years it is that you want to look backwards. Only looking back can you see, oh, maybe we should have done it this way. We should have done it that way. Some of that also, I think, has to do with what are the goals and objectives of a company, right? And for a long time now in the U.S., we've not necessarily taken long view, if you will, of things like revenue and returns and stock dividends and so on. People lament often that Wall Street looks at a quarter-to-quarter scenario, and yet other countries, other management styles look much more longitudinally at how a company develops, what the meaning of that company and its products are to a country. But yet here in the U.S., we pride ourselves a lot on entrepreneurialism, on individuality, on innovation. And to some degree, I think we will always have it. It might just be a question of what its effect is or what kind of an effect it may have, what kind of an advantage it may give us. I'm certainly not an economist and I'm certainly not a lawyer. I suppose there's probably some kind of a balance that one has to find in terms of being innovative, being entrepreneurial, being open with what you develop versus continually or constantly trying to put your arms around something, protect it, hide it, not share it with the rest of the world. I certainly don't begrudge anyone making a profit off of their work, but I think you, at any point, have to ask yourself, what is in the long-term best interest of not only my company and the people that work here, but also what is the long-term best interest economically for my state, for my country, what have you.
Yeah, and I think for me, it'd be interesting just to get your perspective on how's the federal and how are states investing, and what's the opportunity to really promote and empower that innovative thought and to drive a new focus on manufacturing capability and, quite honestly, that think tank. And in the past, we know how they've done that with Tiger Teams and Skunk Works. I've talked about the Great Space Race. How's the U.S. government, state and federal level, investing in this? Investing in innovation and really trying to promote and foster that for companies.
Well, the federal government, working here now at a university for a while, the federal government, and even to some degree the state government, there are a number of funding vehicles for people to get funding to support their work and development, technology transfer, economic development. I mean, there are a number of things people can go after. The list is too long to name them all, but certainly we're seeing maybe a renewed interest in, say, the federal funding agencies funding work that people are doing that might relate not just to developing per se a cool new idea or something that has not existed before, but really extending that out to a practical application, a practical demonstration, a near market ready kind of a product, as opposed to just a basic research outcome. From a state level, at least here in Indiana, the state is investing quite a bit. Its manufacturing sector, it already invests quite a bit into its agricultural sector, at least here in Indiana. Manufacturing and agriculture tend to be two of our biggest revenue generators from a state level. And one of the things I think that we're doing now, at least here in Indiana, is also beginning to develop a workforce that is, I'll say, more nimble, arguably more technologically literate, potentially, than maybe the workforce of the past. I think one of the things we're seeing is investment into a range of workforce development opportunities, not just high school programs, not just university programs, not just community college systems, but things that actually cover the entire educational spectrum, but also things that are not necessarily degree-based or diploma-based, but things that allow the incumbent workforce to reskill or upskill as needed when technologies change. And I think that's critically important, because we can support research and development to our heart's content, but if we don't have a way to translate that research and development into a functional product, and then a product that can be reproduced and sold and arguably generate revenue from, the ability to build an entrepreneurial ecosystem, if you're lacking some of those things, is not very easy to do.
It's definitely not sustainable.
Not very sustainable at all.
And then you get into the scalability of it, and that just falls off a cliff. And that's one reason, from an IPX perspective, we launched the Idea Academy. It's innovation driven by excellence and accountability. And it's a passion of mine when we talk about what workforce development truly should be in 2023 and beyond. Like you said, beyond high school, it's beyond higher ed, but it's also, from my perspective, there's an opportunity to make education and development more functional at that K through 12 level, from a skills perspective, from a technology perspective, getting them in and included in some of these STEM research offerings. And then from a higher ed and then workforce development, how do you think we're going to integrate all this with these funding vehicles? Typically, from my experience, this is obviously, can't speak too intelligently on it, but there is a disconnect between what's known from a funding and what I could use from a individual and or a small business research perspective. And a lot of small businesses, I know this for a fact, they just give because the funding process could be daunting. You're trying to survive, right? And again, I speak for a small business as a small business owner. See, there isn't a lot of state and or government federal support. Once you're in it, once you're in the grind, there's not a lot of time. And maybe that's my mistake, and I'm gonna look into it a little bit further and put some time into it. But what's your perspective? How are we going to integrate this innovation funding from a research and development, product, manufacturing capability, operations capability? How do we ensure we integrate that need for a modern workforce approach?
That's a really good question, because what I hear, again, I'm not a small business owner. I never have been. I may never be. But what I hear from folks in Indiana, those of us at Purdue who work a lot with external companies or external entities in general from the university, one of the things we hear is folks just don't know where to start. And while some states or some regions of the country are probably better at this than others, one of the key issues is not really knowing where to start. Many state governments have, an economic development office, if you will. Some of them are large, some of them are small, but they have an economic development group. It's part of that group's mission to start up companies, to help small business, to help facilitate some of these things. However, it could be everything from getting capital to getting approval to secure a loan for additional capital to expand your business, to helping with financial management and maybe employee retirement plans and health plans and so on. And so one of the things, another thing I think that would be useful is streamlining some of the public agency, whether it's at the state level or the federal level, streamlining some of the information and trying to develop some sort of common entry point, some sort of common portal. At one time, some of those things did exist, but I'm not sure that there is a good sort of externally facing communication strategy from the people who have the information to the people who need the information. You can travel through Indiana, and I suspect other states are like this as well. Talk to somebody about, why don't you get another machine over here? Or why don't you get 10 more people over here, or what have you? And one of the things that often comes up, certainly not the only thing, but one of the things is, I'm not quite sure how to do that, or I'm not quite sure where to start that process. And so I think but again, having traveled in a number of states, having lived in a few different states, those things do exist, but there's an awareness problem.
Yeah.
There's a communications problem. One of the other things I think that's key whenever we talk about workforce development is, if you keep doing the same kinds of things, you're going to get what you've always got.
Yeah.
One of the areas that I think is challenging and that I think we're missing an opportunity on, when we talk about workforce development, a lot of times we end up talking about either students at some level of the academic structure, or we end up talking about incumbent workers. What we often don't talk about, but I think we should, is we often don't talk about teachers, instructors, professors, whatever, pick whatever level and whatever label you want, but we often don't talk about them. Aside from the fact that, and unfortunately, this often turns political in many cases, is we like to critique those people. We like to criticize those people. We like to vilify those people, when in fact, they are one of our best resources to making any sort of a workforce transformation, whether it be manufacturing or otherwise. And I think one of the things we have to do is begin coming alongside those teachers, especially in the K-12 arena, and supporting them, bolstering their knowledge, whether it be STEM or whether it be something else, bolstering their knowledge, giving them additional tools, providing curriculum they need, providing supplies they need, helping incent them, and developing an incentive structure to, I think, help with morale, to help with performance, to help with bolstering the ranks of our education community. I think it's critically important. Unfortunately, I think we treat the collective I think this is a public thing. We treat education as a very mechanistic, almost production line type of approach. Now, to be fair, if you look historically, why our education is the way it is. Much of it was around the first and second industrial revolutions, when a lot of these techniques and methodologies that we use today came about, right? And for better or for worse, not much of that has changed. I would argue we as a public, and certainly public monies and the people that approve them, have been content to let that be a production and agrarian-oriented education system. So I think, Joe, to be honest, one of the things that I think we need to look at is looking at a more supportive structure, a more supportive community of practice for the people doing the teaching. And then I would also say one of the other integrative aspects of how do we tie all this together is, once a person is in the workforce, giving them everything from real-time help, leveraging technologies that exist today with machine learning, data acquisition and visualization, and so on, to micro-credentialing, on-demand training and educational programs that don't necessarily require as much time as a traditional diploma or a degree comes from. Now, the last thing I said is not necessarily new. Folks have been talking about that for a few years. One of the challenges you have is someone has to generate that content. Someone has to generate that infrastructure. But the first one I mentioned is something that's a little bit newer. Using some of our advanced computing, analytics, visualization, machine learning, bringing that together. Historically, in the past, we would have called that on-the-job training. And we would have had a new person shadow a more experienced person, or vice versa. We'd have that more experienced person shadowing that newer person. We might have given someone a checklist or a reference manual or what have you to let them go back to whenever they needed it. And that's what our technology allowed. But what that required was the worker to recognize that they had a gap in their knowledge, go seek out the appropriate mechanism to fill that gap, and then continue on. We can actually come at this from the other direction, which is implementing more intelligent algorithms, machine learning. I'm not using the word artificial intelligence on purpose, but because that just starts to get off the rails in a hurry. But the idea is supporting workers in a way they may not necessarily recognize where they have a gap, but a machine learning algorithm can pick up over time where they're making errors, where they might be faster at a particular task or where they might be slower, and then adjust the information that comes to them, adjust the flow of the work potentially until the worker has an opportunity to improve, whatever that might end up being.
I think your perspective on this network, this support network, and how all the tools we do with algorithms and machine learning, that's a whole nother discussion. But your perspective from the education side of the house with our teachers actually echoes my opinion on small business owners and even large corporations. When we're talking about how do we really propel innovation and capability within the U.S., I do believe we need a support network. And it needs to be really evolutionized. Right? And we need to think of it from all those perspectives, because when you stated it that way, quite honestly, I never considered from the professor, from the teacher, the instructor. We do it with our instructors. We're always ensuring we know what's out there, the latest trends, the latest processes, technologies, the tools. But I do feel like that is something we should all feel responsible for. It has been, and you said we are quick to critique in this country for sure. And that's a pet peeve of mine. We are really quick to just throw an opinion out on a person based off their personal preferences. At times it baffles me.
Or based only on what we can observe.
Correct.
And we may not know an entire story.
Correct. And for example, I don't know Elon Musk personally. I really don't care. As long as he's not violating anything outside of the guardrails of what we define as right and wrong here in this country, who cares? But what I will say is some of these great minds, when innovation is fostered, when they have a support network, you look at Mark Cuban, you look at Elon, you look at Jeff Bezos from Amazon. When that innovation, that spark is fostered and supported, they had some level of network, right? I don't know what it was. Look at what happens. Look at the jobs it creates for this country. What would happen to this country today if Amazon didn't exist? If SpaceX, Tesla, all of these companies started from innovation and they were fostered and supported. And I really love that you brought that topic to this episode, because we should also, the teachers, because that's where the knowledge is.
One of the things I think that's critical here, and we've been doing it, we've been building it in the nascent stages of a couple of our programs that we're doing with STEM in the elementary schools, is the concept of a community of practice. Folks use that phrase off and on in various contexts, but I think it's important that a community of this is a technique or a methodology, if you will, that we can use in a number of different applications, because a lot of the problems we're trying to solve today are not singular problems. They're problems that involve systems of things, usually, not always, but usually. They also often involve the knowledge or the talents of a number of different kinds of people in order to solve. And none of us at this point have all the knowledge necessary to address a particular challenge, whether it be social, economic, whatever. And so I think, one, we have to start acting in a more systemic way, along with some systematic kinds of principles. Another example, when I talk about supporting teachers via community of practice in whatever their topic or their discipline might be, another thing is, and this is more that's the systemic side, right? A little bit, something that often happens on the systematic side is assessment. And assessment is, I have a love-hate relationship with assessment. As somebody who is trained in education, you have to assess, regardless of whatever educational philosophy you subscribe to and whatever pedagogical practices you subscribe to, right? You need to assess. And whether that's assessing in a formal sense in a school setting, or whether it's assessing maybe in a slightly informal setting, whether it be an extracurricular activity or whether it's an on-the-job kind of scenario, but you often need to assess because you want to know whether the educational intervention you just had or you just presented has actually worked. And some people, I use the word assessment, but a lot of people will use the word test, right? You give somebody a test. Tests can take a variety of forms. They can demonstrate a variety of outcomes. They can even be done for a variety of different reasons. But I think one of the challenges we've got is we've turned testing or assessment in general, even on the job sometimes, into this punitive thing and not treated it as an assessment, almost like a quality control check, but also a learning opportunity also. Yeah. It just floors me at times. And again, this could be a whole separate episode on its own, right? But it just floors me sometimes that we penalize educational settings for poor test scores, if you will.
I think, as usual, this will be a two-part series, because I do want to dive into the assessment on the education side, but also on the industry side, because that's where we live and breathe as well. But what I would like to do is just, for our audience, closing out this episode, there's a lot here to process.
Yeah.
And my challenge to you as an individual, to you as an organization, regardless of size, is if you truly, your audio should match your video, as a good friend of mine, Ron Harvey, says. I state it a lot. It's a beautiful quote. If these are passions of yours, and you do feel a need to see manufacturing and innovation really fostered within the U.S., then you've got to figure out how to be a supportive part of the network. Go back. So my challenge to the listeners is, what are you doing? Are you critiquing? Are you complaining? What are you doing to make it better? What can you do to make it better? And I think there's a lot as individuals and companies where we need to foster and support our network, whether it be the education providers, the workforce development providers, professional services, your supply chain. We need to figure out how to move up the plateau. It doesn't have to be a pyramid. But Nate, again, thanks for joining me on this episode. Look forward to our part 2 talking about assessments, because it's a passion of mine as well. And sometimes I feel like we just don't invest in the time to do it. But again, Nate, thanks for joining me on this episode. Look forward to talking soon.
Thanks, Joe. We'll see you again next time.
Thank you for tuning in today. Don't forget to subscribe and review the show. And for more information on IPX, visit ipxhq.com.